I was 68 years old the day 6 sheriff's deputies stormed onto my front porch with their hands already resting on their holsters, and before I could even shut off the garden hose, one of them shouted, "Sir, get on the ground now." I remember staring at the stream of water running across my wife's rose bed and thinking it was strange how something so peaceful could suddenly become the background of the worst day of my life. My name is Walter Grayson, and until that afternoon, I had spent almost 20 years living on the same quiet street in Ashwood Ridge, a sleepy neighborhood outside Lexington where everybody waved when they drove past. Everybody knew whose dog belonged to which house, and where the loudest excitement usually came from kids chasing basketballs into the road. My wife, Eleanor, had passed away 4 years earlier after a long fight with cancer, and ever since then I had kept myself busy the only way I knew how. Every morning I brewed the same coffee, walked my old Labrador named Duke around the block, then spent a few hours tending the flower beds Eleanor had designed herself. She always said roses demanded patience because they rewarded kindness slowly, and I suppose somewhere along the way I started believing people work the same way. That belief lasted right up until Victor Langley bought the property next door. You know the type. New luxury SUV every other year, expensive watches, always talking loudly enough for everyone nearby to hear how successful he was. He couldn't simply own a nice house. He needed everyone else to recognize that he owned the nicest one. During his first week, he installed security cameras everywhere. Not just a doorbell camera. Cameras on every corner of the house. Cameras overlooking the driveway. Cameras aimed toward the sidewalk. Even one mounted high enough to watch half the street. One Saturday afternoon, while I was trimming my hedges, he walked over with a grin and pointed proudly toward one of the cameras. "These things record everything in crystal clear quality," he said. "You can't be too careful these days." I smiled politely and wish him luck. Looking back now, I should have paid closer attention to the way he said everything. It wasn't about protecting his family. It sounded more like he enjoyed watching people. At first the complaints were small. My sprinklers splashed too close to the property line. Duke barked once when the mail truck arrived. A maple tree dropped leaves onto his freshly washed truck after a windy afternoon. Every conversation somehow ended with Victor reminding me he had everything on camera. Eventually, I stopped trying to explain myself. Some people aren't looking for solutions. They're looking for victories. Then one afternoon, he accused me of deliberately letting my garden hose spray onto his decorative stone walkway. I apologized, even though the wind had clearly carried the mist across the fence. He folded his arms and laughed. "Old man," he said, "you're going to learn this neighborhood doesn't work the way it used to." I didn't answer. I simply picked up the hose and went back to watering Eleanor's roses because arguing with someone determined to be offended never accomplishes much. A few weeks passed quietly, or at least I believe they had. Then came that Tuesday. It was warm enough that I had opened every window in the house. Duke was sleeping beneath the porch swing while I knelt in the flower bed planting 3 new white rose bushes I'd driven nearly an hour to find because they were the same variety Eleanor had loved most. I remember humming an old country song when tires screeched outside. By the time I stood up, there were flashing lights filling the front yard. Deputies rushed toward me with commands coming from every direction. "Face down. Hands where we can see them. Do not move." I dropped the hose immediately and lay on the grass, completely confused. Cold steel cuffs snapped around my wrists while neighbors peeked through curtains. Someone whispered my name. Someone else pulled out a phone. I kept asking the same question. What happened? What did I do? No one answered until a deputy leaned close enough for me to hear. "Your neighbor reported that you threatened to kill his family with a handgun. He says you pointed it directly at his children." For a second, I honestly thought they had the wrong address. I had never owned a handgun in my life. I hadn't even raised my voice that day. Then I looked across the street and saw Victor standing beside his mailbox with his arms folded, wearing the smallest smile I'd ever seen, just enough to tell me he believed the story was already over. And as they lifted me into the back of the patrol car, I had no idea that the very cameras he loved so much had already recorded the beginning of the end for him. The ride to the county jail only lasted about 15 minutes, but I swear it felt longer than the 4 years I spent watching. Eleanor slowly disappear inside a hospital room. Nobody said much. The deputy sitting beside me wasn't rude, just distant, like he'd already decided there was nothing left to figure out. I kept replaying the afternoon in my head, searching for some moment that could possibly have been misunderstood, but every memory came back the same. I'd been kneeling in the dirt with a pair of gardening gloves, planting roses while Duke slept under the porch swing. There wasn't a gun because there had never been a gun. There wasn't an argument because Victor hadn't even spoken to me that day. By the time we reached the jail, confusion had slowly turned into something much heavier. Fear. Not fear of prison exactly, but fear that once people believe a terrible accusation, proving your innocence somehow becomes your responsibility instead of their responsibility to prove you guilty. The booking officer took my fingerprints, photographed me from 3 different angles, asked me routine questions, then led me to a holding cell with a concrete bench that looked older than I was. My knees hurt almost immediately. Arthritis doesn't care whether you're innocent. It hurts all the same. That first night, I barely slept. Every time the heavy steel door clanged somewhere down the hallway, I'd wake up wondering whether Duke had food, whether someone had remembered to close my garage door, whether my roses would survive another hot afternoon without water. Funny the things your mind worries about when your whole life suddenly falls apart. The next afternoon, I was finally allowed one phone call. I called my niece, Emily. She lived 40 minutes away and worked as a physical therapist. She answered on the second ring. "Uncle Walt?" she said, already sounding nervous. I tried to explain everything as calmly as I could. There was a long silence before she quietly asked, "You never own a gun, right?" I laughed, but it came out sounding more tired than amused. "Emily, the only thing I've pointed at anyone lately is a garden hose." She believed me immediately. That may have been the first good thing that happened since the deputies arrived. Before hanging up, she told me she already had someone in mind. A civil litigation attorney named Claire Donovan. Claire had built a reputation handling wrongful arrest cases and neighborhood disputes. The kind of lawyer who didn't waste time making dramatic speeches because she preferred documents to emotions. 2 days later, I was released pending further proceedings. Walking out into the parking lot felt strange. The world looked exactly the same, yet nothing felt familiar anymore. Emily drove me home in silence until we turned onto my street. My mailbox had been knocked over by someone backing into it. The front lawn looked dry. Duke practically launched himself through the front door when he heard my voice. Then Emily handed me an envelope resting against the porch. Temporary restraining order. My stomach dropped. According to the paperwork, I had to remain at least 300 yards away from Victor Langley at all times. The problem was simple. My own house sat barely 200 feet for his fence line. I stared at the paper for almost a full minute before asking the obvious question. How exactly am I supposed to obey this while living here? Emily didn't have an answer. Neither did the deputy who eventually stopped by to explain that enforcement would depend on circumstances until the hearing. It sounded ridiculous because it was ridiculous. A legal order had effectively turned my own property into a place where I could accidentally violate the law by watering my tomatoes. Victor, meanwhile, seemed delighted. 2 days later, I spotted him standing beside his driveway as I carefully checked the mailbox. He waited until I looked his direction before smiling. "Beautiful neighborhood," he called out. "If you don't like the rules anymore, maybe it's time to sell." There wasn't even anger in his voice. Just satisfaction, like a man admiring a painting he'd finally finished. I almost answered. Instead, I remembered something Eleanor used to say whenever difficult people crossed our path. Never interrupt someone while they're digging their own hole. I simply walked back inside. That afternoon, Claire Donovan arrived carrying 2 legal pads, a laptop, and enough confidence to fill the entire living room. She listened without interrupting while I explained every interaction I'd ever had with Victor, from the sprinkler complaints to the endless comments about surveillance cameras. When I finally mentioned the camera system again, she looked up for the first time since opening her notebook. "Everywhere?" she asked. "Pretty much," I answered. He was proud of them. She leaned back in her chair. "Good." I blinked. "Good." Mr. Grayson, people who obsessively record everything usually forget one important detail. Cameras don't take sides. That sentence stayed with me. Claire immediately filed discovery requests demanding every piece of surveillance footage Victor possessed from the day of the alleged incident. His attorney objected at first, arguing privacy concerns, but after the judge reviewed the circumstances, the order was granted. Apparently, Victor had spent months bragging to neighbors that his camera network captured every movement around his property in ultra-high definition. Those same statements now became impossible for him to deny. Waiting for the footage felt longer than waiting inside jail. Every day, neighbors reacted differently. Some avoided eye contact completely. Others offered awkward smiles that somehow felt worse than open hostility. One elderly couple quietly left homemade cookies on my porch without saying a word. Another neighbor crossed the street just to avoid walking in front of my house. Reputation spreads much faster than truth. That's something I learned the hard way. About 3 weeks later, Claire called. Her voice sounded unusually calm. "Can you come to my office?" she asked. "I think you'll want to see this yourself." I drove there expecting another delay or another legal complication. Instead, I found a large monitor already connected to her laptop. She pressed play without saying anything. The timestamp matched the exact afternoon Victor claimed I had threatened his family. The camera angle showed my front yard perfectly. There I was, kneeling beside Eleanor's flower bed. Gardening gloves, small shovel, garden hose. Every few minutes I'd lean back to stretch my knees before returning to the dirt. Duke wandered over once and dropped a tennis ball beside me. I scratched behind his ears before continuing to plant roses. 40 minutes passed on screen, then another 20. Not once did I leave my yard. Not once did I approach Victor's property. More importantly, not once did any firearm appear because none existed. Claire paused the recording. Now watch the corner camera. A second video began. This one overlooked Victor's own driveway. It showed him walking outside, glancing toward my yard, then pulling out his cell phone. He looked around first, almost making sure nobody else was nearby. Seconds later, he dialed 911. We couldn't hear the conversation, but we didn't need to. The timestamps matched perfectly. According to his report, I was supposedly waving a handgun at his children during those exact moments. According to his own surveillance system, I never came within 50 feet of his property. Claire folded her arms and let the silence hang in the room. Finally, she said, "He didn't just exaggerate. He fabricated an entire felony." My chest tightened, but it wasn't relief yet. It was something closer to disbelief. After weeks of wondering whether anyone would ever believe me, the truth had been sitting inside Victor's own hard drive the entire time. Claire wasn't finished. She opened another folder containing additional clips recorded by different cameras around his house. Together, they established one uninterrupted timeline showing exactly where everyone had been throughout the afternoon. There were no missing gaps, no suspicious edits, no opportunities for his story to survive. The evidence didn't merely support my innocence. It completely destroyed his accusation. Claire closed the laptop and looked directly at me. "Walter, this case just changed." I asked quietly, "Change how?" She smiled for the first time since we'd met. "This isn't your word against his anymore. It's his word against his own cameras. And when someone knowingly files a false police report, triggers an innocent man's arrest, and causes measurable damages, the conversation stops being about defending you. It starts becoming about holding him accountable." At that moment, for the first time since cold steel handcuffs closed around my wrists in my own front yard, I realized Victor Langley wasn't preparing for my trial anymore. He was about to face one of his own. The hearing that followed wasn't dramatic in the Hollywood sense. Nobody pounded tables. Nobody delivered long speeches that left the courtroom silent. Real life rarely works that way. Instead, the truth arrived quietly, one piece of evidence at a time, and by the end of the morning, it had become impossible to ignore. Claire began by asking the judge to dissolve the restraining order immediately. Then she introduced Victor's surveillance footage exactly as his own attorney had produced it during discovery. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. Victor had spent months telling neighbors that his cameras never missed a thing. That morning, they didn't miss the one thing that mattered most, his own lie. The judge watched nearly an hour of uninterrupted footage. There I was, exactly where I'd always said I'd been, kneeling in Eleanor's flower bed, brushing dirt from my gloves, pausing every few minutes to rub my aching knees before planting another rose bush. Duke wandered into frame more than once, chasing a butterfly across the yard while I laughed to myself. It looked so painfully ordinary that even the prosecutor quietly shook his head. Then Claire displayed the synchronized footage from Victor's driveway camera, showing him calmly walking outside, looking toward my property, checking his surroundings, pulling out his phone, and making the emergency call at the exact moment he later claimed I was threatening his family with a handgun. There was no panic, no frightened children running inside, no frantic attempt to protect anyone. Just a man standing comfortably beside his mailbox while inventing a story that would send his neighbor to jail. Victor tried to explain that perhaps one of the cameras hadn't captured everything, but that argument collapsed almost immediately when Claire overlaid timestamps from multiple recording angles, creating one continuous timeline with no gaps. Every camera agreed with every other camera. Every second contradicted his sworn statement. The judge leaned forward, removed his glasses, and looked directly at Victor before asking one simple question. Mr. Langley, would you like to explain why your own surveillance system disproves every material allegation you reported to law enforcement? Victor opened his mouth twice before any words came out. None of them made sense. Within minutes, the temporary restraining order was dismissed. The prosecutor requested that the court forward the evidence to the district attorney for review regarding a knowingly false police report and related criminal offenses. Watching Victor leave the courtroom that day, I noticed something I hadn't expected. He didn't look angry anymore. He looked scared. A few months earlier, he'd been absolutely certain that money, confidence, and the first accusation would be enough to destroy an old widower living quietly next door. Now he understood that evidence doesn't care how wealthy you are or how convincing your story sounds. The investigation moved surprisingly fast after that. Detectives interviewed responding deputies, reviewed the dispatch recordings, compared Victor's written statement against the video evidence, and eventually concluded what Claire had recognized the first afternoon we watched those recordings together. This hadn't been a misunderstanding. It had been intentional. Victor was formally charged with filing a false police report, and although the criminal case ended with a negotiated resolution rather than a lengthy jury trial, he accepted responsibility after the evidence left no realistic defense. My civil case continued separately. The county acknowledged that the deputies had acted on information they reasonably believed at the time, but they also recognized that I had spent 2 days in jail because someone deliberately manipulated the emergency reporting system. After several rounds of negotiations, they agreed to settle my wrongful arrest claim without admitting wrongdoing, allowing both sides to move forward. Between that settlement and the judgment requiring Victor to reimburse my legal expenses and additional damages, I received enough compensation to repair the financial damage the ordeal had caused. More importantly, my name was cleared. Neighbors who had quietly avoided me began stopping by again. Some apologized. Others admitted they hadn't known what to believe. I never blamed them. Fear spreads quickly through any community, especially when children are mentioned. The real lesson wasn't that people had doubted me. It was how easily one confident lie could outweigh decades of quietly living an honest life, at least for a little while. About 2 months after everything ended, a real estate sign appeared in Victor's front yard. His house sold before autumn arrived. I never learned exactly where he moved, and honestly, I stopped caring. Holding on to bitterness would have given him one last piece of my life, and I wasn't willing to surrender that. Instead, I hired a local landscaper to help me redesign the strip of ground along the fence separating our properties. We built a small memorial garden with a stone bench, flowering shrubs, and rows of Eleanor's favorite white roses. Every spring they bloom brighter than the year before. Sometimes I sit there early in the morning with a cup of coffee while Duke's replacement, an energetic rescue dog named Charlie, chases squirrels across the backyard. The cameras next door are gone now. The house belongs to a young family whose little girls occasionally wave through the fence and ask if they can smell the roses. I always tell them yes, because flowers are meant to be shared, not guarded. Every once in a while, someone driving through the neighborhood recognizes me from the local newspaper article about the case and asks whether I ever get angry thinking about what happened. The truth is, I don't think about Victor nearly as much as people assume. I think about Eleanor. I think about patience. I think about how she used to remind me that character isn't measured when life is easy. It's measured when someone gives you every reason to become the worst version of yourself, and you choose not to. Victor wanted cameras because he believed they would help him control the people around him. In the end, those same cameras became the most honest witnesses in the entire neighborhood. They didn't care about wealth, pride, or reputation. They simply recorded the truth until someone was finally willing to watch it. So now I'd like to ask you something. If you had been in my position, would you have accepted an apology and moved on, or would you have taken the case all the way through the courts exactly as I did? Let me know in the comments because stories like this always spark strong opinions, and I'd genuinely like to hear where you stand. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share it with someone who still believes the truth has a way of catching up with people, even when they think they're safely hiding behind a camera.